Hello, my name is Kim Crayton. I am a person who is recent to tech or recent to code. But my specialty is mentoring and introducing people to tech. And I'm really passionate about finding more effective ways to teach coding. So that's my background.
I'm Amy. I'm currently coding functional JavaScript, but was able to rewrite an application with my teammates in Clojure and ClojureScript the year before last. So I went from being an intern to being introduced to the wonderful world of Clojure. And so now that I'm dealing with mutable JavaScript, I'm deepening my appreciation, and I think that Clojure is an ideal language for introducing people to code.
Hello, my name is Byron Woodfork. I am a software crafter for the company known as Eighth-Light. Some people may be familiar with one of the more known people there, known as Colin Jones, the guy that wrote Mastering Clojure Macros, I believe is the name of the book. I forget, but yeah. So I work in various technologies as a consultant. So my current project is in Java. I try to code in Clojure anytime that I can. Have worked on one of my favorite clients, the startup, whereas the entire backend is in Clojure. And that's when I really got into Clojure and really enjoyed it and got to experience it. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything.
Hi, I'm KF. Right now I work as a data engineer at Simple. Before that, way back when, I worked in teaching and then went to a boot camp and learned to code. And I worked in distributed systems infrastructure, and then eventually that segued into doing data engineering in Scala and Clojure.
Hi, I'm Mark Engelberg. For several years, I had the pleasure to teach at a school where they gave me the freedom to use any curriculum I wanted and teach with any technique I wanted. So I had a chance to experiment with a lot of different computer science curricula, and I became really attracted to the option of teaching a beginner's course in Scheme and gradually transitioning students to Clojure. I've also had the pleasure of working with several students individually over the course of many years, watching them go from knowing nothing about coding to becoming expert programmers. And I've had the opportunity to mentor some adults as they make the transition to functional programming, and to consult with a couple companies who wanted some training for their programmers to get better at functional programming as well, and Clojure.
All right, so we're going to start out. One of the main things that I wanted to bring to this panel is for people to really, as I said, my background is mentoring. And so when I decided to learn to code, people kept saying, oh, it's so easy. Oh my God, it's so easy. Lies, all lies. It is not easy, it's hard, but it's doable. And so what's happening is, the majority of the people don't even understand how technology and code even impacts their lives, and it's happening every day. And then those that kind of get it don't understand anything about code, or understand that they can be producers of code instead of consumers of code. And I tell people all the time, I'm not political, so I don't care who you voted for or what your beliefs are, but if you believed anything about these jobs coming back, they're not. And people are not prepared. Before in transition, when people got laid off, you could take a 6-month course and find another skill. It takes more than 6 months to learn this stuff, and people are just behind the 8 ball. And so it's very important to me that we bring more non-technical people into tech. There are so many people, and I'm sure you know some, very non-technical people who are managing technical people. They have no idea what they're doing. They don't even know what you're doing. And so there's a whole gamut of people out there who really need to understand just computational thinking, and then a simpler way of coming into code, whereas right now everybody's coming in at web development. That's too many moving parts if you don't even know what a variable is. So that's why I want to have this conversation. So the first, we'll spend some time talking about what are some of the challenges and strategies you see in introducing people to code, period.
Yeah, so coming back to your point about whether it is easy or not easy to code, I think my experience with coding was that, initially I would not be able to understand something. It would be like looking at a magic eye, and then through exposure and through practice, you begin to see things. They just pop out. And so one of the challenges is that when you try to then convey that to somebody else, you're already seeing that. It's already clear to you. And so there's magic, and actually there's process and skill in terms of being a good disseminator of this information to actually teach these skills. And so I'm with you. I want to look at how we can get better at doing that.
So one of my favorite examples of when I got started in coding, like my mentor, or one of my mentors, he sat down with me and he was like, all right, Byron, we're about to learn Ruby. And he's like, first thing about Ruby, everything's an object. And I was like, what the heck is an object, right? Like that's like the most basic component of code, right? And I had no idea what it was. So like just taking a step back to like think about those things where we, in our views of things, like it may be obvious, but to someone that's new to code, like these things aren't obvious. And one of the ways that I've taken it upon myself for anyone that I decide to mentor in the future or currently is I was keeping track of, I was writing blogs, right? And keeping track of my knowledge levels, and when I learned something new, I'd write a blog and keep track of that. So when I would mentor someone, I would go back and read these blogs and remind myself all right, I didn't know what this was, I didn't know what that did and whatnot. So that helped me jog my memory and keep me in a state of remembering and having those things in mind when explaining things and breaking things down to new apprentices.
Yeah, one thing that I've experienced, because I've primarily worked in functional programming languages since I started coding, people who are drawn to functional programming a lot of the time have a background in math or something similar. So the metaphors and things that they reach for when they're trying to explain topics don't translate very well when you're talking to someone who's completely new to coding in the first place. So I think trying to separate what you're explaining from that is really helpful. Also, in the same vein, you're discussing, what was the? No, lost my train of thought. You're talking about sort of writing things down as you're going along. I think it's really, yes. I think it's really helpful, especially when I'm onboarding new people onto my team or something like that, that we both do that simultaneously. I have a repo that's today I learned, and every day we sit down and write something, and then we share with one another. So admitting your mistakes as you are going along in real time, just as they're writing blog posts in the same way, is really helpful, because it makes things feel more approachable because they feel like they can make more mistakes.
I think one of the biggest challenges that newcomers to coding face is that often we start by teaching them the same tools that we use as programmers in the business, and we forget that those tools aren't necessarily designed for beginners. They're designed for people who are expert at programming. And the littlest things can be completely overwhelming to a beginner if the error messages are something they don't know how to interpret, if they don't have a good mental model of what's going on with their code or with the tool that they're editing the code even. All of those things can be huge obstacles. So anything we can do to simplify that, I think, is really, really useful in terms of helping out beginners.
One of the things that I have a mentee who, and I don't consider myself a developer. I understand code. So she's doing code.org. And I like the fact that she understands what loops are and functions are and all these things, and knows absolutely nothing about what JavaScript is. She's not asking about Ruby. She doesn't know any of those things. So when we went to a hackathon recently, she had a problem that I wasn't going to help her with, because at this point you need to figure it out. And so I said, but go to these people and ask them to give you some suggestions. And she was able to effectively communicate. I have this maze I'm trying to go through. I have a for loop. It needs to increment. And she was saying all these things so people understood her, and she did not talk about language. That's the thing, one of the things that newbies get too quickly into is what language should I do, this thing that I do. It's not even about that. I believe that we should start with I call it the ABCs of coding. Every language has a variable. Every language has functions. Every language has loops. Every language has these basic things. If we could teach those things before we start talking about other things so they can at least understand that. So when they go to these different languages, come to Clojure or whatever, they're not just like in the dark, you know? Because to me, an object is an object. You know, it was not like I wouldn't think of it as a code object. But one of the things examples I use is if you could, in trying to help with computational thinking, have someone, let's say we do a virtual reality experience and they go through a grocery store trying to connect these things to their real life. If they're going to the grocery store and they're got a cart, right? They pick up an apple, that's a variable. It's only an apple because we say it's an apple. It could be anything we say. The cart is an object, we put things in it, you know, those kind of things. And if people can really see that this is how these things that they think are so complex and not for them because it's over my head or it's for the other guy is what they're doing every single day, then they're like, oh, maybe I can see myself in it. And Mark has a great example of, he has a very unique job. And I want you to talk about that because I tell people, technology touches everything. And when I speak, I tell people, raise your hand if you can think of any industry that technology does not touch. And not enough people are ready for it. So tell people about what, they're very unique. I mean, it's a very niche.
Yeah, right before the panel, Kim was asking me what I do. And my main line of work is I'm a game designer and puzzle inventor. And the way that I use programming is to solve and generate new kinds of puzzles. So the example I gave her is, let's say, you know, there was this point in time where Sudoku suddenly took off, right? And you needed to have Sudoku puzzles in every single newspaper in the country wanted to carry a Sudoku column. So up until that point, people were constructing Sudoku puzzles by hand, and now they need a big database of many, many puzzles calibrated at different levels of difficulty. So I'm the kind of person you would call in to say, hey, we need to figure out how to make these puzzles on a massive scale, and that's the kind of thing I would do.
Exactly, and so it's like, I'm sure somebody out there who right now thinks coding is medical transcription, if I hear that one more time, it is not medical transcription. People think it's just nerds with their head down. That seems like a fascinating job, you know?
I think so. I mean, I enjoy doing it.
Exactly, you know? It's not, you know, the old smelly guy in the corner anymore. It's for everybody. And so people need to see that. I apologize if I offend, but that's not my intention. Everybody knows that visual. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is the challenges of specifically bringing people into Clojure, be they new to coding or be they just new to Clojure. So.
Yeah, I mean, if I can change the question just a little bit to say that being introduced to Clojure was incredibly valuable to me. It's just now that I'm dealing with JavaScript and some old, very state-dependent, very mutable code that I am realizing the business value of having, you know, code that is comprised of pure functions. They're easier to test. They're easier to build with. And so now I'm seeing the value of it. And you mentioned blockers to Clojure, and I think KF was hitting this on the head. It's, you know, when we look at books like Learn You a Haskell, or, you know, when we talk about monads and functors before we actually talk about the ease of manipulating data with an elegant language like Clojure or Scheme, then we're really preventing people from falling in love with coding. And so I think that if you can take functional programming and emphasize the simplicity and emphasize the building block nature of it, you're going to draw more people in, because I can tell you that it's a lot easier to wrap your head around traversing a data structure or mapping a function over a data structure versus dealing with a mutable state in JavaScript. It's just easier when there are fewer moving parts.
Yeah, so recently, like in our office at 8th Light, one of our newest apprentices, like, he was given a challenge to build a tic-tac-toe in Clojure. And I was asking him like along his like way of doing it. I was like, have you like experienced any like issues in like building out this game? And he's like, yeah, like it's been all right, but like one of the problems that I've run into is I wanted to like test drive this game loop that I was building, and I could like find a whole lot of documentation on test driving loops in like Ruby or Java, but when it came to Clojure, it's like there wasn't as many resources out there. And I was like, yeah, it's like one of the things where you'll suffer when it comes to like a language that's newer in a smaller community. So in terms of like bringing people into Clojure, like that's like an action area for us as developers, is to not only like build upon like all these libraries and like go deep into like learning Clojure, but to also like go back and help introduce people to like simple things such as like test driving a game loop, or and basically like helping people get like that beginner knowledge so that like they can eventually speak on Clojure and like work in it at the level that we do someday. Like it's like too often I find people like will get into a language such as Clojure, for example, and want to become masters of it, but they forget that a part of mastery is teaching others as well, right? Like mastery isn't just knowing this thing and knowing it yourself, it's being able to teach others and bring others up, like similar to how you were brought up, except with mentoring, so.
Yeah, I think one of the upsides to using Clojure as more of an introductory language for junior developers and people new to coding is that you can talk about things in terms of functions specifically. My first language was Scala, so it's functional programming, but also object-oriented. So you kind of had to have this idea of how you wanted to organize the hierarchy of all the things you were representing in your code before you could even start like building the functions in the first place. So doing things like test-driven development was really difficult. Even just understanding basic things like when I first started learning to code, I didn't understand why you would want to log things, which sounds like I understood why you'd use print line statements, but not like logging things, because the idea of logging things was this entire framework that you were adding onto it. I had never done anything in production before. So just the overhead of that, doing something when you're doing object-oriented programming can be kind of confusing. Whereas by comparison, when you're doing something in Clojure, you can scope things down to the point where it is relatively easy by comparison to write a test case. So you can do things like test-driven development, but also be building on the JVM, so you can also do it in production and introduce people who are newer to coding to different areas of coding than perhaps you would expect. I know you were mentioning earlier that a lot of the time people sort of push people into web development. I don't necessarily think that's always like where you have to push people if they're new to coding. You can push people into backend, you can push people into front end, you can push people in all kinds of directions, as long as you have the right abstractions to set them up with for them to get started.
I think to answer this question about the challenges and benefits of teaching Clojure, we really need to understand what audience we're talking about. Are we talking about challenges and benefits of Clojure to complete beginners to programming, or are we talking about teaching Clojure to other expert programmers? It's a completely different answer depending on which audience you're talking about, I think. With people who are new to beginning, I think we've addressed that pretty well. It's hard to teach any professional language, but there are a lot of things we can bring to the table as being an easier paradigm to learn potentially. But one of the things that was exciting to me, when the first company contacted me about training, they explained that they had a bunch of expert programmers on staff. They were a web consultancy, and they decided they wanted to learn functional programming. And they picked Clojure because they perceived that to be the most welcoming community of all the functional programming languages, one of the easiest and most accessible functional programming languages to learn. And when I heard that, I was like, yes, this is what we want, right? So I think this is an exciting niche that we might want to actively pursue as the community, as just billing ourselves as, the greatest functional programming language to learn if you're already doing programming. In that context, I have found that the biggest challenge is the distinction between learning how to do functional programming and the kind of programming they're used to. Specifically, one of the things we tend to hide a lot in Clojure, because we have these great functions like map and filter that do a lot of work for us, it's easy to teach Clojure in a way that you might accidentally not give them the skills they need to drop down and do kind of a loop recur process if they need to do something that can't be done well with the higher order functions. So we need to make sure they understand the underlying sequence abstraction that everything operates on and how to process that as deeply as possible.
I want to speak to, I've took several notes, but I want to, first of all, before I go any further, so I went to my first Clojure conference in Austin and didn't know boo about Clojure. But I wanted to bring attention to a person, Paula. We went to get chocolate and ice cream. And in that time together, she was able to explain Clojure in a way that I was actually like, man, I might want to learn this. And it was just so nice. And she was able to juxtapose it to other languages. Like, so she talked about how Clojure is different, and I don't know Java either, but she was able to say how Clojure is different in Java, how Clojure is different from JavaScript. And those things, it made it really simple for me. And also she connected into why Clojure is important. So she talked about the Intel chip. And how Clojure, well, don't act like you're ashamed over there. And how Clojure is able to use, I guess it's 4 different chips in there or something. It's and other languages aren't able to do that. And so it was just like really fascinating. And so, I just wanted to bring that up because it was like, this is a very welcoming community. And that's one reason why I reached out to Alex. I was like, I want to do this conference again. I know I can't do a mentoring talk again, but I really want to talk about of the communities I've been in. I can see that you guys really, it's really important for you to have community. Not that others aren't, but I guess maybe because you're so small, you're a smaller community, it's easier to touch. And so it's really welcoming. And so just like when you talked about functional programming and versus object-oriented, you know, it's like, huh? It's for somebody who just doesn't get it. And so, and also documentation. How can we help build this community by adding documentation? Because if that's one of the things that's missing, that could help new people, help people transition into this language, how can we better facilitate that for them? How can we, again, explain the differences in a very succinct and effective and simplistic way, the differences between functional programming and object-oriented? Because honestly, I still don't know the difference. And those are the things that newbies struggle with, because if it doesn't have people like Clojure practitioners talking about it, we're only getting information from the people who, I mean, everybody knows about JavaScript. Everybody's, like you said, everybody's doing React and Redux and whatnot. And just the community here is so welcoming. And that's what newbies need. Newbies need an environment where they feel safe, where they feel safe to make mistakes, where they feel safe to ask questions. And you guys have it here. So how can we build on that? How can we, those 3 things, how can we, that's just my, simply explain the difference between functional programming and object-oriented, if there's a way to do that. How can we work on documentation, and how can we continue to build a community? And before you say that, I wanted to say, there's an unsession of this later today where we have 2 hours, because I really want to dig down and come up with some action plans of how we can do this in community. So it starts at 7:30. I just wanted to make sure I put that in before I forgot. Okay, go ahead.
No, that's an excellent question. I remember my mentor's right here. I'm really grateful for Ryan. He, you know, on an individual level, introduced me to Clojure in this way that opened up a whole world for me. And I did really struggle with the Clojure documentation when I first started, because the language that we use in the Clojure documentation is formulaic in a way that is beautiful once you understand it. But if you are a newcomer to the documentation, it's very difficult to understand even simple parts of the language. And so again, going back to my magic eye metaphor, if there are people who can take it upon themselves to write blog posts to explain some of these fundamental functions, like Mark was talking about, understanding what's actually happening underneath these maps and these filters, we can help guide people to the documentation and help them leverage it better. I know there are code cartoons out there, like Lynn Clark does a bunch of really amazing code cartoons for JavaScript, and there are just people who are bringing in illustrations and art and explaining code in these really clever ways that help people understand these fundamental building blocks, and then once they actually go into the REPL to look up the doc pages for a certain part of the language, they can understand it and then drill deeper and say, hey, what are we doing with cons, And so that's a great question.
So there's two aspects of this. There's, as he was mentioning earlier, the aspect of teaching someone who's a beginner and teaching someone who has worked in another programming language before. And in my case, I was working in Ruby before I got into learning Clojure. And when I got into it, I was like, okay, mapping over this thing, all right, I'll be able to manipulate this variable that I create, or not necessarily a variable, but this map that I create. And I was like, okay, I don't have the map anymore. What happened? And I was like, all right, so this is an object-oriented for sure. All right, this is what they mean. This is a completely new object, right? Coming to that conclusion is, in my opinion, one of the most difficult things when you're trying to bridge the gap between learning from an object-oriented to a functional programming language. Is mutation, of course. In approaching that to someone that's, whether they're new to program or someone that's new to programming, it'll be a lot more easier to explain that, because you don't have to explain state, right? You don't have to worry about that. You just say, hey, we have this map and we can do things to it and it spits out a different map. And they'll be like, okay, you say so, for sure. Whereas someone that's coming from an object-oriented language, for example, you're just all right, it's gonna spit out a new map, you don't have that old map anymore. And they're just what? Why is that a thing? I don't understand. I wanna mutate one thing. I just wanna mutate one thing. Oh, Clojure has atoms? I'll go ahead and use that. And that's when you're just yeah, no. Right, so it's a matter of when you have someone that's experienced, trying to get them to grasp the idea of tossing out everything they know almost when it comes to how they're used to working with a language. And then you're just all right, well, you do have loops and you do have ways to associate over maps, and you do have these data structures that are vectors that you're used to calling arrays, and then you have to explain lazy sequences and all that good stuff. But once you get them to that point of hey, this is what you know, let's toss that to the side. And they can come to that conclusion, it'll make things a lot easier when it comes to bridging the gap. It's just going to be difficult.
Yeah, so I actually got into Clojure by writing documentation.
Oh, right.
I was a Scala developer, and my friend Bridget Hillier, who started Clojure Bridge, was first starting Clojure Bridge, and she wanted to write the curriculum to teach workshops. So if no one has heard of Clojure Bridge, it is a nonprofit organization that puts together documentation and lesson plans and curriculum for teaching free beginner-friendly workshops in Clojure to people from underrepresented backgrounds in tech. So that is how I got started doing it. It was literally going through documentation that people in the Clojure community had written about explaining things like how to build Clojure projects just from scratch, and things like map and reduce. And I had taught myself those things in learning Scala, but going through and saying, this does not actually make any sense. And until it got to a point where we could put it in front of a group of people who were inexperienced with coding and with Clojure, and it would potentially make sense to them. So that's how I got started learning Clojure. And I think those kinds of arrangements are really useful in general, especially if you run an open source project, when you're writing documentation, to sort of have someone almost pair with you on the documentation and train them in how to eventually contribute to the code base through documentation is really useful. That's sort of my approach to this.
I actually have very strong opinions about what it means to be a functional programming language. But one of the reasons I don't usually bring that up a lot in conversation is because I found a lot of other people have very strong opinions and completely different conceptions than I do of what a functional programming language is. There are people who think that, you know, any language that has a map and a filter in it is a functional programming language. There are people that think that to be a functional programming language, it has to have a static type system exactly like Haskell. So I've started to use kind of a different way of describing Clojure to people. My elevator pitch these days is to talk about it as lightweight data modeling. That's my catchphrase now for Clojure. To people who have already programmed a lot, I kind of explain how they're used to using JSON or XML as kind of a way to come up with a description of data that can be easily passed between programming languages or passed between server and client. And I say, what would it be like? Just imagine this for a second. What would it be like if you could express all your data like that inside your own programming language and pass it around between your own functions in that kind of form, and you had this rich set of facilities to work with that kind of data? That'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? That's Clojure. So that's the way I like to describe it now. As far as documentation goes, I would say, I mean, they've made some excellent points about some of the things that can be done with documentation, but there are some really great resources out there already worth being aware of. There's a number of really excellent books. So if you're starting from square one, there are a lot of books that will take you from square one and give you that mindset about how to work with Clojure. So, you know, yes, it's not online in a format that maybe is easy to digest, but books are a great way to work your way through something methodically. Also, in terms of learning the standard library, there's For Clojure is a website where you learn most of Clojure's standard library with little problems that kind of force you to implement those functions yourself. And that's a really powerful way. I mean, I was fortunate to start Clojure pretty early on when it had a smaller core, and so for me, as new functions have been added, it's been a gradual process. But when you come to the language for the first time, it's a pretty big core library, which is part of what makes Clojure powerful, but it's tricky to learn all that. So a site like For Clojure is a great way to gain mastery over those functions that are built in.
So really quick show of hands, who here is like on the Clojurian Slack channel? Sweet, so like a decent, solid number of people. If you're not on there, like I super encourage you to get on there. Like there's been, I can't even tell you how many times I've popped in there to ask a question and like Alex has answered. Like, I feel like Alex just sleeps next to his laptop and he's just waiting on like questions to pop up. He's like, yep, there's a way to do that in Clojure. But I say that to say this, like one of the like things that really helped me out, and one of the things that you'll essentially do when you're used to a certain programming language and switching over to another is you're like, all right, like how can I write an if statement? How can I iterate over a collection? And like I was doing those things and like trying to like make the transition. So I'd write out the code in Ruby, and then I'd say, all right, like how can I write this in Clojure? And I'd blog about it. And I'd say like, all right, this is how you do this in Ruby. This is how you do this in Clojure. And like keep making those comparisons. And someone that's used to that language that you're coming from and going to will be like, okay, like that's how you do it. And like those are the building blocks. And all right, this isn't as scary. Like these parentheses don't mean too much. And you know, so. Yeah.
We have a few minutes for maybe one or two questions. So we have the mic if anybody has anything they want to ask, statement they want to make.
Hi.
Hello.
We're really loud now. I actually find the problem introducing Clojure to people is not with beginners. Like beginners have an open mind and they're willing to try anything, and they're you can kind of demonstrate the beauty and simplicity of the thing, and they get it, and they're I have a much harder time showing it to people who actually have coded for a long time. like people who are way into Java or JavaScript or something like that, it becomes almost like an ideological struggle in a way, because like you said before, Byron, you have to take all that stuff you learned and just set it aside. And I think for most people that's not something that they're willing to do. Like, they've struggled this whole time to learn these things, like all these lessons are hard won and you're just telling them to like start over again, So I wonder about that kind of barrier, like how you approach introducing something to Clojure for someone who already has their mind made up about the right way to do things, I guess.
I'll speak about that just briefly, just because of adult learning theory. Adults don't want to make, because this is the only industry, again, where it's all right to make mistakes. People actually pay you to make mistakes. You wouldn't want a doctor who got paid to make mistakes. So every other field, you're brought in as an expert. And so that's what people are used to. So if I'm an expert in this, and now you're saying I have to go back to square one, that has a lot to do with how adults learn. So one of the things we have to do when we're talking about adults is make a safe environment. And that's why I believe mentoring is so key, because that's a relationship. And relationships are, when you have a healthy relationship, people feel safe enough to share what their fears are, to ask questions, and do all these other things. If you don't feel safe as an adult, I'm not gonna expose myself to you. So one way to make sure that they are able to throw that away is saying, you know what, it's safe. Nothing's gonna blow up. I got you, I'm holding your hand, but they have to feel safe with you to make that leap, because again, you're taking somebody who knows something and now you're taking them to where they don't know anything. And that's a beat up for the adult ego. Anybody else? That's all you, sir?
Yeah, so most people who are new to coding, if they're lucky, they get work with someone who is not new to coding. And so we are overcoming a lot of inertia. And Paul Graham wrote an essay, The Blub Paradox, kind of about this, and raised two challenges for people who are enthusiastic about Clojure, although, of course, he wrote the essay a long time ago. So he was enthusiastic about Common Lisp, and he thought Common Lisp made him very wealthy. So there are two challenges. One challenge is Common Lisp was his secret weapon when he was in business. He was competing against people who were not using Common Lisp, and he ate their lunch. So if you got a secret weapon, you do not spend a lot of time talking about that secret weapon. You don't share it. Mm-hmm. And the other challenge is that it's hard to explain to people what they're missing. And Mark sort of talked about this with the lightweight data modeling. Paul Graham's theory that the thing that made Common Lisp his secret weapon was macros. And just try explaining to people why they should want to learn about macros and why they should want to learn about a language in which they could use macros. That's hard. And I wonder whether there are examples in Clojure usage now that would make it, that are examples of what macros have bought us that would alleviate that problem.
Well, the quick answer to that is when I describe to other programmers, when I show them core async and explain that it was implemented as a library, and I ask them to imagine how they would write that in their favorite language, that usually makes the point pretty quickly. As far as teaching macros, I usually start with just some basic things to kind of show what macros can do that functions can't, like implementing a short-circuiting OR keyword, some things that are built in, so they understand why you can do that stuff with macros. But then I usually invent some kind of odd control construct, and I say, what if you decided you really wanted this in your language? Any other language, you'd have to wait a couple years and maybe hope to convince the design team of this language to include this control construct in your language. But here you have the ability to add that yourself. So I find that just by working through a couple simple examples like that usually makes the point that yeah, it gives you some power of being able to do this without having to wait for others to do it for you.
All right, as we can see, people are coming in, so we are done. Again, I want to thank you guys for coming up. Hopefully, I'll see some of you at the unsession tonight so we can really get to work and see how we can make this happen for not only newbies to code, but newbies to Clojure. Thank you.